This is Raul Lopez, and you're listening to How Do You Say Success in Spanglish? The path to success isn't easy. For minorities and people of color, many attempt this journey with little to no guidance. Join me as I sit down with individuals who share their stories of perseverance so that together we can learn how to say success in Spanglish. What's good, mi gente? This is Raul. Today we have a very special guest. We have David Blanding. Hey, David.
How's it going?
Good. Thank you for being here today. I'd like to start off just kind of read David's professional bio a little bit. David Blanding is an associate professor of the practice of international and public affairs at Brown University's Watson Institute of International Affairs, where he also serves as the faculty director of Master of Public Affairs program. In this dual role, he teaches courses on subjects like race and public policy, stakeholder engagement, and policy analysis. He also advises students on experiential learning projects and provides high-level strategic direction to the MPA programs. Thank you, David. I appreciate you being here today. I really appreciate you taking the time to kind of be here on my podcast.
Absolutely.
I know you're originally from New York, so I'd like to kind of start off, and let's start off from the beginning. Where did you come from? Tell me a little bit about how life was and how you were in New York.
Sure. So I grew up in the South Bronx. In fact, I always tell people that I grew up in a housing project that was right across the street, actually right across the highway. The highway is the Cross Bronx Expressway from a housing project where Sonia Sotomayor, now Supreme Court Justice, was born and raised. It wasn't named after her then, but now that project bears her name as a testament to who she is. So I grew up there. I lived briefly in Brooklyn for a bit, and I was always kind of bouncing around between Brooklyn, where my mother lived, and the South Bronx, where my grandmother lived, since my grandmother raised me for part of that time, and it was also given where I was going to school. A much better place for me to be in many respects throughout those elementary and secondary school years in particular. So
you mentioned your grandmother and your mother, and I think you mentioned before with me that they were pivotal role models for you in your life, and they were pretty much the ones that helped raise you. So can what influence did they have, at least early on when it came to either your hard work or any other characteristic for success that you think that you've had?
Yeah, so I think my mother and my grandmother, both in their own right, models of perseverance and compassion and resilience. My grandmother was a woman who decided to go to college as a 30-something-year-old single mother who was on welfare, who had 4 kids, and went to college, earned an early childhood education degree, and then got into early childhood education for a number of years. And my mother was a woman who had a number of specific life struggles, I think, that are associated with a certain socioeconomic status of people who are born in the 1960s and grew up and came of age in the 1980s during the Reagan years, the war on drugs and that sort of thing. And she had to deal with those challenges that came with that. And she did. And she went from a place where she had lost custody of us briefly. And during that period, actually, my grandmother actually took custody of myself and my younger brother. And then while she had us in custody, my mother was working toward, getting better, getting sober, to do what she needed to do to get us back. And then she eventually did, which I think is really impressive. And so my mother was present at pivotal stages in my life when I was being exposed to great opportunities like ones with nonprofit organizations that really advanced my educational development in ways that would not have been possible otherwise. But I couldn't have done that alone. I couldn't have done that without her taking me to meetings and interviews and school visits and all of that kind of stuff. At the same time, I wouldn't have been there if my grandmother hadn't done what she did. And simply by virtue of the education that she had obtained herself, gave me opportunities and exposure to things I wouldn't have had access to. And just by way of illustration, I had this great series of biographies when I was a little kid. And I remember having them as early as like second grade. They were biographies of famous Black leaders. And I would read about Dr. King and Nat Turner and Langston Hughes and Paul Robeson as a 7-year-old. And that really provided a ton of inspiration for me, but also was incredibly valuable education, right? I was reading these multi-chapter books at an age when lots of kids not only couldn't read like that, but didn't have the ability to get access to resources like that. So I was learning substantively about topics, about people that fostered my own development. And at the same time, engaging in activities that allowed me to kind of stimulate my mind. So I think it was that combination of two that was really transformative for me. You know, it's one thing to have somebody in your life who is willing to step in when, there's a need, right? Because whether it's a parent or somebody else that you're lacking in something, it's another thing to have somebody do that to you, expose you to things you wouldn't have exposure to, even if you had been, in an otherwise intact traditional family, and then have a person come back and say, you know what, I made a mistake, I messed up, I didn't do it the way I should have done it, and I'm going to do it the right way, and I'm going to enable you to have all sorts of things I didn't enable you to have, just a few years ago. So for me, those two people, among others, but certainly at a critical early point in my life, were instrumental in my being able to have the opportunities that made me who I am today.
And at that early stage of your life, was the idea of college, pushed upon you, or is that something you knew you wanted to go to? Or I know, especially growing up in those type of neighborhoods, not everybody's prone to go to college, or that's not even a discussion for most households. For you, did you know you wanted to go to college early on, or was that kind of?
I think I knew, but not in not with the level of clarity at that time that I think I later developed. And it was ironic because my grandmother did not. She was a non-traditional student, so she didn't go to college in the traditional way. And even if she did, she never pushed that upon me. She never even established it as an expectation. Her own kids, including my father, who's her son, did not go to college. And so it wasn't an expectation, not for lack of concern about education, right? But there wasn't that kind of pressure. And I often talk to some of my counterparts, including some I went to school with, about the pressures that they face in terms of educational attainment. I never had any of that. What I did have was a lot of support. If I had said I wanted to stop at high school, people would have been proud of me. If I had said I wanted to stop at an undergraduate degree, people would have been proud of me, and so on and so forth. So I had people who provided me support without any expectation. In some ways, I think that students who have enormous pressure upon them benefit, right, from being pushed in that way. In some ways, they struggle under the weight of those expectations. I know many people who really could not deal with having to carry that burden of being the one in their families who had to do that. I was very much self-driven and self-motivated, but precisely because no one else had those kinds of, or pushed upon me those kinds of ambitions or expectations. I do sometimes wonder if somebody had pushed me, if I would have gone farther or achieved more in my life. In the way that some people I know have. But I've also think that the lack of expectation, really the lack of strict expectations with respect to, where I went to school or what type of degree I pursued or when I did it, right? I think that enabled me to chart my own course in a way that was probably healthy for me and might be healthy for other kinds of kids.
And so in order to get that, you say you were self-driven, were you signing yourself up for things, or did you put yourself into programs or anything that helped you guide there, or were you just kind of trying your best in school? And
yeah, it was a mix of both. Like I was always an ambitious kid. I always had high hopes for myself, high expectations for myself, but I can't take credit because success is a mix of luck and foresight, right?
Yep.
Opportunities have to come your way, and you don't always get to control which opportunities come your way, right? I would not have known that Prep for Prep existed, and I certainly could not have applied to Prep for Prep. Prep for Prep is a program for high achieving students from New York City, right? I don't know that I would have known about that program, let alone been admitted, if I had lived in a place like Houston or Iowa or Des Moines, Iowa, or what have you, right? Because their reach is not that way. And there aren't comparable programs in some of those places. At the same time, I wouldn't have been able to get into the program had my mother not accompanied me there, right? I found out about Prep for Prep because an assistant principal at a school I was attending at the time recommended it. At the same time, I also know I could not have gotten into that program if I wasn't sufficiently self-motivated to go through all those steps that were required, right? I had to take an exam. I had to, first of all, have a certain academic attainment before I even got into the program, before we could even be eligible to apply. But then we had a whole exhaustive application process that included traveling to Manhattan to take exams, doing interviews, doing an IQ test, right? I had to want to do that. And because unlike some other kids, I didn't have a mom or a grandmother who was like, no, you must go. It was me. It was me saying, I will get up and do this. I want to do this. And in fact, one of the great things about my mother, I think, was that when there was a pivotal opportunity for me to go one way or the other, when it came to admission to that program, just by way of example, I'm the one who made the final call that changed the outcome. When I was admitted to Prep for Prep, I was actually admitted late. So they were kind of not sold on me, I guess, is the way to put it. Yeah. And the way it worked is at every successive stage of their admissions process, which is a multi-month process, or at least it was when I was there in the mid-90s, you got a letter of rejection or a letter saying you advanced to the next round. And I was advancing to the next round. And then finally, there was a point where I had heard nothing. And I was given a choice. I could either go to camp, which I had been going to for a while. It was part of this other great nonprofit organization called Fresh Air Fund that my grandmother had actually got me into, which I like to call study abroad for poor kids. And so I was at the home of the family I was staying with, and I believe it was Vermont at the time. And I had just arrived there, and I believe it was a Friday evening. I was having dinner, and my mother calls me on the phone, and she said, hey, I forget exactly how she opened up, but she basically said, you've been admitted to Prep for Prep. And she was like, I'm proud of you. But, and this was the catch, you have to come back home because the classes start on Monday. And I was like, wait a minute. I have to come back home. I had pretty much resigned myself to the idea that I had been rejected, but they maybe had just, the rejection got lost in the mail or something. So I was fine. I'm going to have a normal summer like everybody else and go to camp. And then in that moment, I was also like, if I wasn't good enough to be admitted before I got up here, why should I care? Like, it's sufficient validation for me that they had admitted me that I didn't know that it was worthwhile and then have to go sacrifice this thing I was going to commit to. But she didn't force me. She didn't say you have to come back home. She didn't say, I'm ordering you to come back home. She said, look, as I was hemming and hawing a little bit and expressing that to her over the phone, she said, look, I will support you essentially in whatever decision you make, but just remember, you were the one who wanted to show up for those interviews, and you were the one who wanted to apply, and you were the one who wanted to go to this interview and that interview, and you worked so hard to do this, and you made those choices, you made that commitment. She was kind of like, it would be a shame if you gave that up, but she never at any point said you must do this. And that being compassionate, but also allowing me autonomy was the right kind of thing I needed at that point. And I made the decision myself to show up. And so I just say that to say that for me, that success has resulted from people seeing things that I would not have been aware of and connecting me to opportunities I would not have known about. Yeah. My grandmother with Fresh Air Fund, my mother with Prep for Prep, and that assistant principal with Prep for Prep. But then also me having the foresight myself to recognize opportunities for what they were and to take advantage of them. I can't take credit for opportunities I was given that I wouldn't have known about, but I can take credit for following through on them and not giving up on them or on myself when I had these chances.
Yeah, and with Prep for Prep, they probably supported you through your process to apply for college and get to college. And when you were applying for college, you were getting to college. Like, did you know you were going to end up going to Boston University, or were you kind of all over the place?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I will say there are Prep for Prep is a phenomenal organization. Let me say that, and it's too bad that there aren't organizations like Prep for Prep around the countries and possibly around the world. It takes an enormous amount of resources to do what they do. And even with those resources, as a social scientist, I can tell you that the scope of their impact, right, is relatively limited, right? And I'll say more about that in a second. But my point is this: they were instrumental in my getting into not just Boston University, but every college I think I applied to at the time, and there were other similarly, elite, prestigious, well-resourced schools in DC and Boston and New York.
And in that program, were you guys, was the majority of the kids in there going to big name schools?
Oh, yeah. In fact, I like to tell people I'm the black sheep of the Prep for Prep family. I know too many kids who went to Harvard and Yale and Princeton. And so I remember getting to BU and being like, well, I really messed up. In fact, I remember a friend of mine who went to the same high school I went to, private high school I went through, was not in Prep for Prep, but ended up at BU. And we were feeling we were being self-loathing because we were looking around and realizing that we felt like we squandered the opportunity and the investment that people had made in us because we had not gone to one of these more elite schools. And to be honest with you, it never even occurred to me, not that I would have gotten in, but it never even occurred to me to apply to an Ivy League or an MIT or a Stanford. It just really did not. That was not what was factoring into my decision. I had the very specific reasons for applying to BU, and we used a very systematic process through the high school I attended, and Prep for Prep really helped augment that thinking process that my elite private school had provided on its own. But no, I never. I thought about going to college, but I didn't have. I wasn't as concerned, I think, about brand name and things like that as I think some people would have been. And maybe if I had approached it that way, I might have had a different outcome, not just in terms of where I applied, but all the stuff I might have done to get into school.
And I point out to the fact that it's kind of amazing when you go to a pretty good school like Boston University, and it's considered probably the low level to some of the other people that were in your program with you going to these other different schools, but for kids in that didn't have these opportunities that you had the luxury of having, they just going to a community college might have been the highlight of that school. You know
That's
what I mean?
Right.
Most kids in my school were lucky to go to, a local state school. You know what I mean?
That's right.
The majority of the kids barely graduate, and so, I think you're right. Just the fact that you've had these opportunities, but,
perspective is everything, right? In my community, it was the same thing. Nobody celebrated that I got into Boston University versus, Boston College. People didn't know the difference. I couldn't tell you how many people thought I was going to Boston College when I said I was going to Boston University, or didn't know it was a private school and not a public school, or any number of things, right? People celebrated that I got into college. People celebrated that I got into more than one college. People celebrated that I got into college out of state. Like, people's minds were blown. And that was considered for them a high level of achievement. And to some degree for me as well. It wasn't really until I started because I had that broader frame of reference, right? I knew people were going to these other places, that I was like, oh, wow, this really is not a significant accomplishment. And even so, this is not to be ungrateful, because I'm also mindful that it is true even today that it is a good school, right? It's a good school. And people's perspective is different. I'll tell you a funny story. I think I may have told you this before, but when we were at BU, I was really keen on promoting college attendance for other people as well. And so when I would talk to other young people in and around Boston and in New York City, I would also encourage them to go to college. I would also encourage them to go to BU. And I'll never forget, I was talking to this young lady in the CVS that used to be on Comm Ave. I don't know if it's still there. And I had said something to her like, hey, she somehow came up that she was sophomore in college. And I was like, or a senior in college. And I was probably a freshman or a sophomore at the time. And I was like, oh, so are you going to apply to BU? And she looked at me with this face like, no, I'm not applying to BU. And I was like, what do you mean? And in my head, I thought she was trying to denigrate BU, because here's what she said. She said, no, I'm applying to Dartmouth and I'm applying to Amherst and all that. And I was like, oh, okay. All right. That's fair. If you're going to apply to Dartmouth and Amherst, those are elite, I can understand that. But then she was like, yeah, because BU is so expensive and all that. I was like, wait a minute. That doesn't make any sense. Dartmouth and Amherst are as expensive, if not more expensive than BU. She was like, no, they're not. I was like, yes, they are. And she was like, no, they're not. She was like, yes, they are. She was like, no, UMass Dartmouth and UMass Amherst. And I was like, holy shit. we weren't even talking about the same thing.
Oh yeah.
She was talking about UMass. I swear to God, bro, she was talking about UMass Dartmouth and UMass Amherst. And for that moment, it hadn't even registered to me that we were talking about totally different spheres of college education. And that is so emblematic, I think, of what the experience can be like for so many people from the backgrounds like you and I had, right?
Yeah.
We're looking at the world through a very different perspective. And so here I was being self-loathing because I thought my school wasn't good enough or I hadn't achieved enough. And somebody else is telling me, that's at an echelon they weren't even willing to aspire to.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, and you're right. Perspective is everything, and I think when, you grow up in the type of neighborhoods that we grew up, that you don't get to see everything. You don't have the people, going forward that have achieved some of the same things that we're achieving at our point. That, not to, like I said, not to put down BU. I love BU, but when I was applying to Brown, I was like, I don't want to go to Brown. I was applying for Brown because the program I was in, they were kind of encouraging us to try to apply to some Ivy Leagues. And I applied to Brown, and the first thing I said is like, I don't want to go to Brown. There's too many white people. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Little did I know, like every college is too many white people. I mean, I was going to be a minority at every school that I was going to go to, regardless of who I went to. You know what I mean? But it's that perception. You know what I mean? I'm thinking Boston's going to have more diversity as a bigger city than Pawtucket, Rhode Island. And I'm just going to be, around my people. You know what I mean? And so I intentionally did everything I could to make sure my application wasn't nice, wasn't done right. And, my interview, I didn't really put too much effort into it. And I felt like I could have gotten into Brown, but I intentionally tried to take myself away from that because of the perspective I had at that time, so obviously getting into college is one thing, but then starting college, and once you're in there, it's a completely different journey, so tell me a little bit about how your first year of BU went. So
terrible, but it's actually terrible, but also exactly as in some ways the good folks at the College Board or whoever would have predicted, right? So we know SAT scores are typically a predictor of first year college success. And for me, that was probably a reasonably accurate statement. And not because I wasn't intellectually capable, but because so many things intervene in that first year experience when you're transitioning to an environment like Boston University from an environment like the one I was used to. And I don't mean my private elite high school, but the other stuff that I probably needed some time to get used to it, which I did. Right. So just by way of illustration. So, you and I started college, you right before me, right after 9/11. Right.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So it was a huge influx of people enlisting in the military and enrolling in college, right? It was the start of a big wave of us enrolling in college. Half of people thought they were going to become soldiers. Half of us thought we were going to become diplomats. What that meant, though, for schools is they had more people, more students than they could accommodate. Great financially, but potentially problematic in terms of culture. So at BU, this manifested in for a number of years in succession, they had insufficient housing for freshmen, but expected freshmen to reside in on-campus or campus-sponsored housing. So what they did to compensate for that, as you may recall, is they rented out space in these area hotels, including this 5-star Grand Hyatt that overlooks the Charles River in Boston.
Well, and you got housekeeping too. I remember the housekeeping was included, right?
No, we didn't actually. No, wait, we did get. I'm sorry, I take that back. We might have gotten housekeeping. What we did not get is the furniture.
Oh, okay.
They put in
the dorm furniture.
Yeah. But it sounds like a great deal, right? They put us in our own wing of this hotel, beautiful 5-star hotel. We got access to the facilities. It was not such a great deal because we were in Boston. It meant we were separated physically from the main campus, right? Yep. It's not like we knew the campus so that we could navigate it easily. We had to commute by, a shuttle bus, which they arranged, which is nice. And that's all fun and games until that first snowstorm hits in Boston, and they were hitting a lot that winter. And the bus wasn't running on time, or you were getting to campus late or whatever it was. And that, for me, partly threw off things, right? And I wasn't connected to the main campus culturally, socially, otherwise. I didn't see people. If I recall correctly, the unlike in other dorms where that first few weeks, right, you have events going on, you have everybody's doors open, you can freely meet people. We couldn't do that. We weren't allowed to just keep our doors open, even though we were in the same wing of the hotel. In fact, I think when we first got there, we didn't even know that we had that wing of the hotel, several floors in that wing of the hotel. So it was kind of hard to connect with people. We would physically disconnected from the main campus. And then you had the logistical issues of getting to and from class from literally another city on the other side of the river, on the other side of Charles River. So, and then the few times in my case that I did go to campus, it didn't go well. We engaged in the type of behaviors that stupid freshmen engage in, and we got in trouble. And I remember what was a turning point for me in some respects was I met up with these guys I hadn't met before. And we went to a party on West Campus, right? So one of Boston University's preeminent areas for young students to connect and engage. We went to some party. There was some drinking going on with some people. And an RA comes by and, we knew enough to know that the RA shouldn't see the alcohol, right? So they tried to hide it. But, we had this very brilliant guy that was there takes this bottle and puts it in what he thinks is a discreet place under a chair. RA comes in and he's like, all right, have you guys been drinking? No, of course nobody's been drinking here. What do you mean? He goes, so what is that? And points right under the chair. And it's alcohol. And then I look at this kid, it's like, are you dumb? Why would you put that there? But anyway, so that instance resulted in us getting a modest punishment, but it was enough of a wake-up call for me that I was like, wait a minute, I cannot afford this. I remember that we were all talking afterward, and everybody's reaction was very different. I was the only Black kid. That was the other key thing in this story. A lot of these other kids were middle-class white kids. One kid was like, oh, my dad's going to be mad at me. Another kid's like, oh, I don't want to get into too much trouble. Other kids are like, it's not going to be that big of a deal. We didn't do anything wrong. It's just a little bit of, pre-college stuff. But in my mind, I'm like, wait a minute, I could get kicked out for this. What if I get kicked out? I don't want my story to be, I went to college after all of this fanfare about me going to college. And then within a couple of weeks, I did something stupid that caused me to get kicked out and blew this opportunity. And it ended up being fine. We got penalized, but it wasn't so severe that I couldn't, continue classes. But my response to that was, I need to cut this altogether. And I completely withdrew from social life. And I decided I was going to get a job. I decided that the idle hands are the devil's playground. And in order to avoid getting into any trouble, I was going to get a job and I was going to work as much as possible. And when I wasn't in class, I was going to be working. That's what I was going to do. And I went and got a job in the dining hall. And that's where you and I met.
Yeah. And I was just going to mention, I was like, it's hilarious the way you mentioned that and the way how this event kind of changed your perspective on the social aspect of college for some part. You know what I mean? Because when I went to work at the dining hall, we were working late night cafes. So we cook all the foods, the fried foods to all the kids at night when they come down and they use their points to get food. And the thing I remember the most about you is, first, I think me and you were the only minorities there. I was the only Latino and you were the only Black kid there. Yep. And you were just constantly with an angry Black man face. You were just standing there with your headphones on, not interacting with anybody. And you were just always just really, really mean mugging everybody. And I remember coming there and I'm like, he's the only minority here. Let me go talk to him. And so I think I kind of just pestered you a bit. And then we came into a few situations where we go back to the scenario with you living in a hotel on the other side of the river, where we would work till 11 and the last bus was at 11. And so there was nights where you were walking, 11:30, 12 across the river by yourself, freshman, first time in Boston, across the thing. And I lived much closer that I was just like, just come crash at our house for the night. You'll leave in the morning. You know what I mean? Yeah. And I think that's kind of how we started becoming friends. But it's just hilarious to me how you were so antisocial at the job and how it kind of puts perspective in it where you were like, I'm here for a purpose. I ain't trying to mess around.
And that's what it was. I wasn't angry. I was motivated. I was trying to be disciplined. I was like, look, I just got into this serious situation because I wasn't focused and I'm about to squander this opportunity. I need to focus. And it wasn't, I think I probably swung the pendulum a little bit too far, right? Because I think and now that I'm a professor, I can say with confidence, and I tell students this, I tell parents this, college is about so much more than what happens in the classroom. And you have to give your students the space to grow and mature in ways that college allows you to. If you let it, if you spend all of your time in a classroom or a lab, you will not be the kind of student that will have a successful career in this country. But for me, it was a survival instinct kicked in. You know, all of those things that I was told as a kid, where it was like, you don't go to school to make friends. You don't go to school for the teacher to like you, and all that kicked in. And I felt like I had forsaken some of those foundational principles that make a lot of sense when you're a poor kid growing up in environments that you don't consider your own, right? And navigating spaces you don't consider your own because you're trying to survive in them. You're not thinking about how to thrive. You're not thinking you own them. You're not thinking you're entitled to them in the way that other kids who have been accustomed to those environments feel. And so I reverted back to that. And that was where that focus came from. I was like, look, I need to quite literally tune out, the noise of social life and remember that this is a university and treat it basically as if it's a job. It's another job and get another job that earns money and another job that prepares me for the future.
And it's funny because the one thing I remember the most about you was you were always working. You would have one, maybe two jobs. You were always doing something.
I had at least 2, if not 3 jobs every single semester I was at Brown. I was working at least 40 hours a week.
And was that financial reasons mostly, or was it a mix of both? The social, keep me out of trouble, and
it was both. It was financial. It was strategic with respect to being focused. It was strategic with respect to my long-term ambition, right? So I was eligible for federal work study, so I had a work study job. I considered that my resume job, meaning the one that I would tell future employers about. But you may recall your hours were limited, right? Mm-hmm. And so I had that job that I knew would potentially be impressive. That was a job that if you ask anybody who hired me or was looking to hire me, after I graduated from college, that's what they would have seen on my resume. But then I had the job that I thought would bring home the money, but wouldn't be impressive to employers, right? That was a dining hall job, right? That was all those hours. Most of my time was spent in that dining hall.
Yeah.
Right. In terms of earning money. And it was because I could earn money by spending more time there. But I never equated that with the kind of jobs that would be valued by employers for better or for worse. And so I was like, I have to have both. I know I need to earn money. Right. And I need this thing to occupy my time, but I also need something that looks constructive to other people when I'm out in the workplace and will matter to those people. And so I was being strategic in that respect. And I always had combinations of those things. I tell people to this day, I had the resume job. If I didn't tell people I worked in a dining hall, I don't think people outside of my immediate friend circle would have known at all.
You're in school, which is a full-time job for most kids in school as well. Yeah. And there's a lot of people who have the luxury of not needing to go and work. You know what I mean?
Yep.
I think both you and I at some point we went through our broke phase in college where we're scraping by, with the little we had. So we don't have the luxury of not being able to work, but to work almost 40 hours on top of your schooling, you know what I mean? And you also were volunteer, you know what I mean? It was like all these extra steps that you were doing. Did you feel it was necessary because you were a poor Black man, or? Oh
yeah, absolutely. I knew I needed to compete in the workplace because I knew that if I had not been poor and Black, there were certain things I would need to do. I would have had to have internships. I would have had to have outside work experience. I would have had to have experience, things that built professional development and built my network, right? So I had to get the internship with Ted Kennedy's office. I had to have the work where I was showing some leadership potential. I had to be a member of or an officer in a student organization like Latinos Unidos, right? I knew I had to do that. And those things were of interest to me too. But I also needed money. So I was like, I need to meet the expectations of these people in the future who are not going to give me any grace because I was poor, but I'm also going to need to do the thing I need to do to survive, right? That I can't tell anybody about, that won't matter to them, but will nevertheless be essential for me to make it here. So I was trying to satisfy 2 masters, if you will, when it came to my education, right? And that's where the exposure to these other social networks and the access to some social capital was helpful, I guess, but also adding some burden, right? Because I knew if I had never been poor, right? If I'm a professor or a career service advisor, I would have told students to do exactly what I did in terms of the internships, in terms of the getting involved in student organizations they were passionate about, and getting leadership experience, right? Getting professional experiences, getting research experience, studying abroad, all that stuff. I would have told them to do all that. So I tried to do all of that myself because I knew everybody else would have been telling every other student to do that. But then I was like, in addition to that, I actually need to pay these bills. I actually need to, be able to afford to quite literally live here day in and day out, and buy food and go out and do all of that stuff. Yeah. So it was both for me.
And I think one of the luxuries from working at the dining hall is when you were broke, you just go to work and eat at work. You know what I mean? Like there was times where I was like, my one meal of the day was when I worked at the dining hall. I'd go 30 minutes early while they were closing up the dinner services, and I'd be able to feed myself. You know what I mean? That was my one meal a day for some time. So
that's right, and that allowed me to switch from the more expensive, I think, unlimited dining hall plan. Because now, once I understood the math, the economics of college, I was like, wait a minute, I can save this amount of money by not having a more expensive meal plan. Let me just do the 1 meal a day plan, right? And I think now colleges have caught on to that, right? And the struggles that first gen and low income students face. And they've, I think, modified the way they approach those things now. But yeah, there are students out there nickel and diming the elements of the education. Do I need to be in student activities? Can I just, meet people outside? Right? And I can save that so-and-so here.
It looks like we got disconnected real quick.
We did.
To kind of go back, we talked a bit about how when you were in college, you kind of had to change your mentality as far as socializing and how things were going, in order to kind of improve yourself from, the struggle that you were getting through initially. How were you able to overcome that and find a balance that you were looking for? I know you said you kind of went really hard on one side of the pendulum. Were you able to kind of balance yourself out?
Yeah, to a large degree. I will say I struck the balance. I was able to stay involved. I was working consistently throughout college. I never worked fewer than 2 jobs after freshman year. I did. But at a time, there was a point where I had 3 jobs at one point. And I was strategic about the way that I engaged with the university, and the way that I charted my life professionally and all of that. So just by way of example, I came in as an international relations and Hispanic languages and literatures major at BU. I thought I was going to be a diplomat. I wanted to study IR so I could go work for the State Department potentially. But at the time, BU had a standalone international relations department, which is one of the things I loved about BU. It's separate from political science. At some institutions, international relations is a subfield of political science. So you can't just take courses in that area, but I was really interested in that. And so that attracted me to BU and the other places I applied to. But what I learned along the way that subsequently led me to change to political science was that in order to complete the international relations degree, you had to take courses in economics. I wasn't really interested in economics. I didn't appreciate it the way I did today. But even more importantly than that, what I knew at the time was that economics textbooks were very expensive. And this was before Amazon was what it is today. And you could get great textbooks at a discount, or you could rent textbooks. They didn't have that rental scheme that they now have or subsequently had. And so you'd pay, $125, $150 a textbook in an econ class, and then you'd have to buy the next edition the next year for the next class or what have you. And basically, I determined that it was more cost effective not to major in international relations, setting aside anything I thought about economics, because it meant if I took the classes in political science, I could study adjacent subjects, but I could find things that were typically available in the library, right? You study political theory, you're learning about Plato. Those books don't change. They're the same price since, 1955. And so I became strategic about everything from course selection to the major I chose. And so in more ways than one, that background that I had was still very much dictating the choices that I made.
you said you were working, you're doing all this stuff in college, and obviously, you've succeeded, and we get to the point where you're graduating and you're looking to go into to grad school. You know what I mean? And how does finances and all that stuff affect your thinking when it came to, yeah, I'm sure you wanted to go to grad school, and I don't know if PhD was your initial focal point, or if it was just let me get my master's first and then go from there. But just knowing that you were looking, finances were a big driving factor. How did that make you decide and kind of contemplate, what is my next step? Can I even afford grad school? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I'll tell you right now, that was a huge driver. I remember hemming and hawing about even the prospect of taking off time between undergrad and grad school. Now it seems silly, right? You take off 2 years, you think it's a big deal. I'm going to get behind everybody else, what have you. But at the time, it was a big deal. And I thought, I'm going to, I don't know if I'll ever be able to go back to school. I had read a lot of research that suggested the more time you spend away from school, the lower your performance on standardized tests is, right?
I was going to say the same thing. Like when I graduated, I was like, I'm going to take some time off work, make my money, and then go back to school. And I've never went back to school because it's just, once you start,
life
happens, it's just much harder to go back. And so, I think that's always my suggestion to people, that just go right away. Don't wait. Don't take time off. Don't try to make money. Go right to grad school. If you want to go to grad school.
Because at that age, I would have said the same thing as you just said. And I consulted a lot of people about it for that reason. In fact, I remember talking to a professor and said, am I making a mistake if I take time off from school? And she said, no. She said, actually take 2 years, literally take exactly 2 years. She said, don't take one, because if you're going to take off 1 year, you pretty much have to know you're going to apply. The summer after you graduate, the applications will be due. If you're going to go to school, if I graduate in May 2023 and I'm trying to enroll in school in May 2020 and, September 2024, right? Roughly a year after I've graduated, that means I will have to apply in September, October, November of 2023, which means I still need to know. And essentially while you're working, just, a few months after you've gotten a job, assume you get a job immediately after you graduate, you're already deep in the midst of applying to grad school. So your mind is not mentally in the present, you're thinking ahead. And she said, that's not good, right? You're going to be bogged down with that. You're not going to be fully invested in your job, and you may not be getting as much out of it as you should be getting. So take 2 years. That'll give you enough space to really learn what you need to learn, to build perhaps a social capital and networks that might help you strengthen your graduate school application, and then go into that program, afterward, whether it was law school or a doctoral program, which were the two things I was contemplating at the time. I actually now more than ever would recommend students take time off, and not simply because I did it, but because I think there's a process of maturation that working professionally full time provides you that many school experiences, I won't say all, but many school experiences don't. I recommend college to a lot of people because it provides a process of maturation that outside of college does not provide you for younger people. But I think it's different from the process that you get after you graduate with a degree and you're working in the field. I see a lot of kids who come into graduate school programs who are otherwise intelligent, diligent, industrious people, but don't have the wisdom that life experience gives you, right? The maturity that life experiences give you, and not in a negative way, but just there's something about having been through things, whether it's challenges or triumphs, that college won't necessarily give you to the degree that a job with responsibilities and rent and all of those kinds of things, roommates or children or marriage or whatever that people often accumulate in the time between educational journeys, that those things give you. So for me, I was strongly considering graduate school. I knew I probably needed to take some steps to strengthen my application, given where I was at that time. And I also thought that being in a professional environment would help me hone my interests, strengthen my network, and potentially strengthen my application for whatever program I ended up in, which initially I was thinking everything from doing a joint JD PhD, which would have been a major investment in time and money, right? And for somebody coming from my background was something I really wanted to weigh very, very carefully. And then doing, one or the other of the two. Where I ultimately landed was the PhD program. And part of the reason, frankly, is I realized that I could be paid to do a PhD but I would have to pay somebody else to do just about any law degree that I would have pursued at that time.
So just to clarify, this is the PhD program at Brown specifically?
That's right.
Okay.
And comparable institutions. So, I came out of BU with about $27,000 in debt. And I was fortunate enough that in those 2 years that I worked between undergrad and graduate school, I was able to pay off about $7,000 in that debt. In fact, I remember I had a discrete loan for about that amount, and I felt such a sense of accomplishment when I paid that off with my little first job salary that I had from working at a nonprofit. But yes, I knew I wanted to go to some sort of higher education. It had always been a dream of mine. In fact, you lose sight of that kind of stuff when you're going through the journey. But when I finished with my PhD, actually, someone I grew up with as a child reminded me that I had told people when I was a kid I wanted to get a PhD, and I had forgotten that, because you forget about all of that stuff when you're in the midst of writing a dissertation or taking classes or whatever. You just forget about that stuff. I was pursuing it because it was important to me, but it wasn't that kind of dogged interest that some people have about things. It was just, I started this, I'm going to finish it, and I'm going to finish it on time. And best laid plans often go awry. And that was certainly the case for me with just about everything I've ever pursued. I thought I was going to finish my PhD in 4 years, which was a record time. And I didn't do it that fast, but I'm proud of when I did do it and finish it, and grateful that I was able to do it. And part of that is because programs like Brown do what they do, and they offer opportunity. They took a chance on somebody like me first of all, but equally importantly, they provide the resources to enable me to be successful, which I think is a running theme in my life, right? You have to, when you're coming from a background like mine, it helps tremendously to have people who see potential in you and are also willing to make an investment in you, right? But again, it matters that somebody like me is willing to take that risk and that chance, right? Going to grad school is a major risk. There are what economists call sunk costs, right? That money that I could have made if I had continued working over those 5 years, plus the year that I spent doing the postdoc, plus the year and a half I spent on the tenure track, I could have made far more money if I had, just stumbled my way around the private sector for a few more years. And so I had to give that up, not to mention things like retirement contributions, right? I was in graduate school, fortunately, during the Great Recession, but I also wasn't contributing to my retirement, and I can't get that back, right? I can never have that time back. That's the one thing we never have enough of, and we can never really get back. So it was a real sacrifice, but it was also helpful to me that, instead of having to pay thousands of dollars and accrue thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars more in debt at a time where I couldn't imagine facing that much more from my background. I was instead making a little bit of money and feeling a little bit more comfortable. And I was actually able, as a grad student, really for the first time, to devote I won't say 100% of my time, but nearly 100% of my time to being a student. Like I would be sun up from sundown doing schoolwork from sun up to sundown. Now, at some point, I did start to get into other things. I worked a number of jobs as a grad student, to everything from the pre-professional advising office to the pre-college program to teaching to being in the teaching and learning center. I worked a ton of jobs in grad school too, and was involved in a lot of other ways outside of that. But at least for those first 2 years that were really focused on courses, I could actually just concentrate. And I would not have been able to do that but for that little bit of money that the university was giving me at the time. It was a paltry sum, but it was more than, just the idea that I could be paid to go to school was such a relief. And it made it so much easier and so much less stressful than it otherwise would have been for somebody in my position to really focus on work.
And I mean, during that time too, you're going to school, your financials, are a big important part in just surviving. You know what I mean? You're away from your family and all that stuff as well. So you're still dealing with all this stuff. But and the mentality you had when you went into undergrad, where you mentioned before that your identity, it's kind of shaken and you're not really sure. And then you're a little more mature. So a few years later, you're in grad school. How does the transition from where, what your identity was in undergrad to, grad school, how were you able to kind of maintain or change, or did you have to refocus?
I think one thing that became eminently clear to me through some pivotal experiences in college, and on into grad school, is that I have an enormous well of resilience. And that comes from the many, many things I had to deal with in college, including the story I told you earlier about that incident that happened. I never got in trouble again after that incident with the drinking. But I also had to deal with, navigating the cost of attendance. I spent a lot of time at financial aid offices. I remember going and practically begging them to do something for me, because I really didn't understand finance in college. I didn't understand that even though my estimated family contribution was $0, that they still expected me personally to contribute toward my education. And so part of the money that I was earning, I thought was just going to be mine, was supposed to go back to my education, which is fine, right? It's not an absurd concept that you would have to pay for your own education, if education is going to be any cost. But I didn't understand that. And so I wasn't prepared for that in the way that I was budgeting, in the way that I was spending, the way that I was saving. I was sending money back home. I thought that first time I had a paycheck, I went back home and bought groceries and Christmas gifts for my siblings. Like, I was balling. I thought I was, just got drafted into the NFL. And then I got the spring semester tuition payment. I was like, you got to be kidding me. And I felt like an idiot more than anything. I felt embarrassed. But I had a few of those instances where I didn't fundamentally understand finance in college. And even though I thought I was doing well, I was on Dean's List by the time I got to my junior year, I believe. And I remember walking into the office. I was either the first or second time I made the Dean's List. And I was practically begging a guy that was there. I was like, I'm trying my best. I just got straight A's. Like, dude, it's not like I'm not trying. I was taking two languages simultaneously. I had not studied French or Italian, but I was taking French and Italian in the same time, in the same semester, while also earning straight A's in that and my political science classes. Like, I was like, I'm trying, but I do not understand this financing and I cannot seem to get my head above water. And I was like, I don't want to withdraw from college because I don't have money. And he was like, and he looked me in the eye, I swear to God, and he said, we need more brothers like you. As a black guy. Well, I don't remember his name offhand. I'll never forget what he said. He said, we need more people like you. He said, I'm going to do something. And sure enough, that bill disappeared and I didn't have it and I was able to go forward. So I had that kind of thing. I had that experience of advocating myself. My mother also died when I was a junior, as you know. And that was easily, and still to this day, is easily the worst thing I've ever experienced in my life. And I was this close to dropping out. I swear to God, I really was. But I also knew that if I dropped out, I would never come back. And I just, that would have been the thought that broke the camel's back after a lifetime with so many different things. I didn't tell the story about what it was like getting onto campus that very first day that I arrived, but I talked about that first semester. It was rough. But my mother's death in the middle of my junior year was incredibly tough. But those experiences steeled me against the kinds of things that, people deal with when they get out of college and when they get into the workplace and when they get into grad school, and it's tough. But after, the idea of walking into an elite campus like Brown with all of the attendant social and economic challenges, I was like, this is nothing to me. There's nothing. I literally, every time I had something difficult happen to me, I would say this: there will never be an experience as bad as my mother died. I can deal with this. There will never be anything like that. And so, there was a point where my grandfather died when I was in grad school. I think he died actually shortly before I took my qualifying examinations to become a PhD candidate. There was a point toward the end of my grad school tenure, I had earned a fellowship from the Ford Foundation. And my youngest brother, who was very young when my mother died, was having some trouble, and my older brother had taken custody of him and the other siblings, and he was just having a tough time. And so I agreed to take legal custody of him and guardianship of him. And so he started living with me toward the end of my college career. So I was dealing with being a parent and, frankly, not a great morning at that. I had no experience. I was, 24, 25, to an 11, 12-year-old child, I think he was at the time. And, I was with my then wife, trying to make things work while also trying to be a student. But as tough as that was, again, I was able to go back to my mother and say, if I survived what I survived with my mother, I can survive anything. And nothing academically troubled me at all. I just knew I could get through it. I knew I had what it took. And I knew that the things I would struggle with would be the things outside of the classroom, if any. But I also knew once my mother died, I was like, if I got through that, I can get through anything. I will finish this program. It's just a matter of when.
And so going back to everything that you've done, everything that you've gone through, we're not even, probably have to come back at a future time to talk more about just the career aspect and, career experience, because that probably a whole new episode just on that aspect of stuff, but, from this point on, from this stuff that you've gone through and this journey that you've done, if you were to go back in time and tell yourself, give yourself some advice, what would be some of the things you'd tell yourself?
Oh man. In an ironic way, as much as I tried, I think I tried to make the most of the opportunities that I had. Like I said, I've been very lucky because the opportunities have come to me, but I've also been very conscientious in that I've taken advantage of those opportunities that have come to me. There are things I still regret, right? I really do regret never having studied abroad. I really, really wish I had done that. And I would probably tell myself not to let any opportunity go to waste and always to be thinking about the opportunities that are available to me and to keep my eyes peeled for opportunities, right? Like I didn't think about the idea of studying abroad when I went to college. And perhaps if I had thought about that from the beginning, I might have put myself in a better position to do that. Now, to be honest with you, I don't know that that's 100% true. The idea of leaving my family, particularly after my mother died, would have been a tricky proposition for me at that time. Mm-hmm. And studying abroad, and there's a little bit of guilt, that survivor's guilt, if you will, that comes with being the child from, in my case, my family and my community that quote unquote makes it, right. And so the idea that I would be, hanging out in France or South Africa or Australia while people I knew back in my home communities were still struggling with basic necessities, I think I probably would have felt some guilt around that. And that probably may have been what inhibited me to some degree from putting myself in a position to do something like that. So I would tell myself, though, not to worry so much about those kinds of things and to position myself as up to think about what else is out there. I think that's one of the most challenging things for somebody like me is you don't know what you don't know. And there are so many things, even now, I now recognize I could be thinking about, I could be asking for, I could be advocating for, that I may not even be occurring to me, but are occurring very much to counterparts who have had more social capital, who've had more exposure to things.
So the advice you're giving yourself, and I like the advice that you're talking about where, focus on opportunities, make sure to be able to take those opportunities, be able to take more risk and not be afraid to, go out there and, and put yourself out there. And I think for a lot of us, we tend to kind of deal with, the cards that we're dealt and just accept them instead of trying to see if we can get another hand or a better hand. And, you talk about finances and, how that guided a lot of what your decisions were. I think that kind of all goes hand in hand where we're used to living a life where, we don't want to sacrifice or do stuff that's going to put us in a situation where we're already going to be more financially, put us in a worse financial position than we were before. So we sacrifice opportunities or our livelihoods because of the fact that, hey, I can't go buy these new shoes because I got rent to make this week, or
right.
Or as a parent, sometimes you won't buy yourself anything for a year because you want to make sure your daughter or your kid has enough for their soccer club or whatever they're doing. You know what I mean? And and for me, part of the podcast was the same thing. For years I put off doing stuff that I wanted because I don't want to put the money into, and even the minimal cost of building a computer and getting the audio equipment was too much for me to risk. You know what I mean? And so, I think, I totally understand, that vibe that you mentioned.
Yeah. And I'll say that I think they're all fruit of the same tree, right? So ultimately, this is all an artifact of our having had a scarcity mindset, as some folks would put it, right? We walk into this world thinking there's a finite pool of resources that we have access to, particularly financial resources, and we draw down from that every time we agree to do something. And so every choice we make is a trade-off between two things that are going to draw down from that fixed pool. Other people grow up with an abundance mindset, right? Where they think the pie can grow. And so they make those investments in something like a podcast or their own personal training or going abroad or what have you, because they figure you can always make more money somewhere else. And I think we ignore the fact that those mindsets are epiphenomenal. They come from, I think, how you've been raised, how you've grown up, and what kind of opportunities have in fact fallen into your lap, right? And whether you had to make sacrifices or you were taught you had to make sacrifices to make things work, versus the notion that you could simply replace things or simply expand or what have you. And for the greater part of my life, and to some degree, even today, I've operated with that scarcity mindset more and more as I've grown up. I've tried to shift toward an abundance mindset, the idea that, I could make more money. I could do more. And so simply incurring more risk, more burden doesn't necessarily mean I'll be, in dire straits, right? I can come out of that, because the pie can get bigger, right? I'm not stuck forever with whatever I may have started with, or whatever I have right now, right? It can, the pool, the pie can grow, can expand. But it takes a while to get comfortable with that. And it takes, frankly, a lot of you actually expanding the actual pie, right? I make more money than I ever made. I make more money than anybody I knew growing up ever made. And more money than, frankly, I think I imagined making when I was a kid. But I think that is in part because of a change of mindset. I'm no longer thinking about, if I do this, I won't be able to do that. And while there is some truth to that, right, there will always be trade-offs to the choices we make. I don't think that those trade-offs have to dictate my life in the way that they once did.
So, I think you put it in beautifully, and I think it's definitely, I think that's perfect and great advice to kind of end on. Thank you for coming on my podcast today, and I really appreciate you. I've known you for a long time, and I appreciate you. And to everybody else, thank you for listening. I really appreciate your support, and hopefully you guys join me again next time, and we'll continue to learn how to say success in Spanglish.
Awesome. Take care, bro.
Take care.